Hello, I'm Amanda Decker. I'm from the Sugar Creek Branch Library. And believe it or not, change can be a good thing. Now, I know all of us here in the library system, we're still having a little bit of a hard time with that because we're going through a lot of changes here as we try to reach out and be the best library in America by 2010. Now, on the other hand, change for the sake of change is not a good thing. As you'll see in my story, whooping it up with the Cook brothers. They embraced change for the sake of change, and they lost a good friend along the way, and a lot more. Now, I am blessed to come from a long family heritage of good, simple, honest, God-fearing, hard-working folk. If you were to look at my family tree, stretching out on the branches on both sides as far back as you could see, you would see those good, simple, hard-working, honest, God-fearing folk, except for a branch tucked back in the back that we don't like to talk about. It's got 2 rotten apples on it, known as the Cook brothers. Now, my story takes place back when Michigan was still more of a territory than a state, and it's told through family journals and letters and diaries. And these Cook brothers were known far and wide for their whooping it up. They were degenerates. They were drunken, depraved louts. They were the kind of guys that if you saw them coming down the street, you'd cross over to the other side and look the other way because you didn't want anything to do with them. Now, this was a time when a man knew the value of a hard day's work, and he'd work his homestead and he'd work his farm. Not the Cook brothers. Oh, no. They didn't work their own homesteads and their own farms. They shared them together. And they were 2 bachelor brothers because no decent woman would have anything to do with them. And they didn't even really work their homesteads. They passed most of that work off to their hired hands. What little work they did was only so that they could get rip-roaring drunk on the weekends because they lived to whoop it up. So Monday through Friday, they'd do as little work as possible. But when Friday evening came, they'd hitch up their faithful horse to the buggy, they'd drive the 3 miles into town, and they would whoop it up at the town's 3 saloons. For even though the town was tiny, it was big enough to boast 3 saloons. So they would drive to that first saloon, get out of their buggy, go inside, and get drunk, and they would whoop it up and make general nuisances of themselves till that first saloon keeper had had enough, and he would throw those bums out of there. And they would stagger to their buggy and get up in it and drive down the street to the second saloon, where they would whoop it up even more, and they'd get rip-roaring drunk as skunks, and make general nuisances of themselves till that second saloon keeper had had enough, and he would throw those bums out of there. Well, by now, it's a little harder to make their way to their buggy and their faithful horse, but they do it because they had that third saloon in mind, and they'd get there, and they would just get drunk out of their heads until that third saloon keeper closed down the saloon and would throw those 2 bums in the back of their buggy, and their faithful horse would drive them the 3 miles home and wait patiently in the barn till they came to sometime that next afternoon, when they would unhitch the horse, stumble to their house, and drink it off for the rest of the weekend. And this is what they did. Week in, week out, they were known far and wide for their whooping it up on the weekends. And nothing changed. Even when the weather was too bad for them to drive into town the 3 miles, they'd whoop it up at home. They'd pull out their stash of whiskey, and they would drink, and they'd sing bawdy songs, and make general nuisances of themselves, and all the neighbors were glad they lived miles away, because they would fire off their shotguns too. They'd fire them off into the ceilings, fire them off into the walls, and the next day when they came to, they'd lie down on the floor looking up at the ceiling. They'd wonder why it was snowing down in on themselves and why all this plaster was all around them. Well, this went on for years. Working as little as possible during the week, whooping it up on the weekend. Their house became more and more decrepit. Their farm holding got smaller and smaller, and their reputation got worse and worse. Until change entered their lives. They decided to order themselves one of those newfangled automobiles from Detroit. Now, nobody's really sure why. Maybe the Cook brothers were ready for a change. Maybe the Cook brothers were starting to hear some of the things that people have been saying about them and wanted to have a different, more modern sort of reputation. Maybe the Cook brothers wanted to whoop it up in a whole new way. Nobody really knows. Nobody in my family can agree on why they did this, but they sent off to Detroit and they ordered themselves one of those newfangled automobiles. And everybody in the county couldn't stop talking about this new bit of foolishness that they were exhibiting. Because what good was an automobile on a farm in Nowheresville, Michigan? It couldn't pull a wagon, it couldn't pull a plow. It was good for nothing. They were wasting their money in a whole new way and just showing what degenerates they were, because everybody knows those newfangled things are never going to last anyway. Sure enough, the automobile arrived, and it was the talk of the county. And the Cook brothers taught themselves how to drive, and that Friday afternoon, they left the faithful horse in the barn. They got themselves into their newfangled automobile, and they drove the 3 miles into town in record speed. They couldn't believe how fast they were going. They didn't know why they hadn't done this earlier. They could have been whooping it up sooner and longer, because now they had a car to get them there. Well, they got to that first saloon, strutted on inside, drinks for everybody. Cook brothers got themselves an automobile, and they whooped it up in a new and high fashion until that saloon keeper had had enough, and he threw those bums out of there. So they got into their newfangled automobile. A little harder to drive now. Drove themselves down to that second saloon. Whooped it up even worse. We got ourselves an automobile, boys! The Cook brothers have arrived! They whooped it up until that second saloon keeper threw those bums out of there. That newfangled automobile took them into a railroad cement embankment and ended their lives. Change for the sake of change is not always a good thing. The Cook brothers should have stuck with the horse. Thank you.